When did the golden child finally lose everything? My brother Kyle could literally do nothing wrong in our parents' eyes, while everything I did was somehow a disappointment or not quite good enough. He'd skip family dinners to hang out with friends, and Mom would say, "Oh, Kyle needs his social time." But when I had drama club, she'd guilt-trip me about missing precious family moments. Kyle got caught cheating on 3 different tests in high school, and Dad called the principal to explain it was just stress from being so talented and overwhelmed. When I got a B+ in chemistry, they hired a tutor because clearly I was struggling and needed intervention. The double standard was insane. Kyle wrecked his car drunk driving when he was 19, and our parents covered it up and bought him a brand new truck because he learned his lesson and needed reliable transportation. When I accidentally scraped the garage door, they made me pay for repairs out of my part-time job money because responsibility builds character. Kyle dropped out of college after 2 semesters, and they said he was finding himself and exploring his options. I graduated with honors, and they said, well, anyone can get good grades if they have no social life and just study all the time. They converted the garage into a recording studio when Kyle decided he wanted to be a musician, but never actually practiced or wrote any songs. When I asked for help with my student loans, they said we need to be smart with money, and you need to learn independence. Kyle would steal money from Mom's purse, and when she noticed, she'd convince herself she must have spent it and forgot. When her jewelry went missing, she assumed she misplaced it. When Dad's tools disappeared from the garage, he figured he loaned them to someone. I tried pointing out the obvious pattern, but they acted like I was jealous and trying to cause drama. Kyle started a business with $20,000 of their retirement money, and when it failed in 3 months, they said at least he tried, and failure is the best teacher. When I asked for $1,000 to take a professional certification course, they said maybe next year when finances are better. The breaking point came when Grandma Dorothy got sick. She needed full-time care and had about $200,000 saved that she planned to leave equally to all the grandkids. Kyle suddenly became the devoted grandson, visiting her every day and volunteering to manage her finances since everyone else was so busy. My parents praised him for stepping up and being so mature and caring. Within 3 months, Grandma's savings were mysteriously draining away. Kyle claimed it was all medical expenses and household needs, but never had receipts. He'd buy her generic groceries and pocket the rest, claiming he'd bought organic everything. He convinced her to sign a power of attorney because it was too stressful for her to deal with bills. My parents refused to question anything because Kyle was being such a wonderful grandson, and how dare anyone suggest otherwise. Grandma passed away 6 months later, and when the will was read, there was almost nothing left. Kyle had drained everything except about $10,000. The lawyer mentioned some suspicious transfers, but Kyle had power of attorney, so technically it was legal. My parents still defended him, saying he must have used it for Grandma's care, and we should be grateful he was there for her. That's when my cousin Ella, who worked at the bank, pulled me aside. She wasn't supposed to say anything, but she'd seen where the money actually went. Kyle had been transferring it to his own accounts, then to a casino app. $200,000 gambled away in 6 months while Grandma ate generic bread and watched her stories in a freezing house because Kyle said the heating bill was too expensive. Ella had screenshots of everything. The transfers to Kyle's account, the immediate transfers to the gambling site. The times and dates match exactly. She'd been documenting it for months but didn't know what to do because technically Kyle had legal authority. I called a family meeting and said I had something important to share about Grandma's estate. Kyle immediately got defensive, saying if this was about money, then I was being disgusting and disrespecting Grandma's memory. My parents started scolding me before I even spoke, but I pulled out the printed screenshots and started passing them around. Here's $50,000 transferred to Kyle's personal account on January 10th. Here's the same $50,000 transferred to BetKing Casino 3 hours later. Here's another $30,000 on January 25th. Another $40,000 on February 3rd. Every single transfer is documented. Kyle tried to grab the papers, saying those were private banking records, but everyone had already seen them. My uncle Robert, who was a cop, asked Kyle if he wanted to explain why Grandma's money was going to online gambling while she was dying. Kyle actually said Grandma wanted him to invest it for the family's future, and gambling was just his investment strategy. The room exploded. Uncle Robert shot up from his chair and crossed the room in 3 steps, getting right in Kyle's face with his cop posture, the one that made people confess to things they didn't even do. Kyle stumbled backward toward the hallway, hands up like Robert was going to hit him, and Mom started screaming at Robert to calm down and stop attacking her son. Dad joined in, yelling that this was completely inappropriate, and Robert needed to back off right now. Robert didn't move an inch, just kept staring at Kyle with this look that probably worked great in interrogation rooms, asking if Kyle seriously just called stealing $200,000 from his dying grandmother an investment strategy. Kyle's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out, and I could see sweat forming on his forehead, even though the house was cold. Mom pushed between them, actually put her hands on Robert's chest and shoved, telling him he was being aggressive and threatening and she wouldn't allow this kind of behavior in her home. I stayed in my chair with the bank statement still in my hands, watching everything happen like I was watching a movie. Aunt Linda was crying into her hands over by the fireplace, and and I could hear other relatives talking over each other, some asking Kyle questions, some defending him, some just making shocked noises. My parents literally positioned themselves on either side of Kyle like they were his bodyguards, Mom on his left and Dad on his right, creating a human wall between him and everyone else in the room. Uncle Robert took a step back but kept his eyes locked on Kyle, and you could see every muscle in his jaw working. Kyle looked around the room like he was searching for an escape route, his eyes jumping from person to person, and then he made his move. He bolted for the front door, shoving past Mom so hard she stumbled into the coffee table. Uncle Robert was faster, though. Must be all that police training, because he cut Kyle off before he even got halfway across the living room. Robert planted himself right in front of the door with his arms crossed, telling Kyle he wasn't leaving this house until he explained where Grandma's money actually went. Kyle tried to go around him, but Robert just sidestepped and blocked him again. That's when my dad did something I'd never seen before in 30 years. He actually pushed Uncle Robert, both hands on his chest, shoving him away from the door and yelling at him to get out of Kyle's way. Robert barely moved, just looked at my dad like he couldn't believe what just happened, and for a second I thought they were actually going to fight right there in the living room. The whole room went quiet except for Aunt Linda's crying. Then Ella spoke up in her quiet voice, the one she uses at the bank when she's explaining why someone's check bounced. She said she'd been watching these transfers for months, and she had documentation of every single transaction. Her voice was calm, but you could hear the steel underneath it. She explained that Kyle didn't just transfer money once or twice. He was moving funds almost every day toward the end, sometimes 3 or 4 times in a single day when he was losing. She had dates, times, amounts, everything. My mom spun around to face Ella, and I watched her expression change from protective mother to attack mode in about 2 seconds. She pointed her finger at Ella and accused her of violating banking privacy laws and betraying family trust, her voice getting higher and louder with each word. She said Ella had no right to spy on Kyle's transactions, and that she could lose her job for sharing confidential banking information. Ella didn't flinch, just stood there with her arms at her sides, and explained in that same calm voice that elder financial abuse is a mandatory reporting situation. She said when bank employees see suspicious patterns of an elderly person's money being drained by someone with power of attorney, they're actually required by law to document it and report suspected exploitation. She looked right at my mom and said she'd been following the legal requirements of her job. Nothing more. Uncle Robert pulled his phone out of his pocket and announced he was calling his detective friend who handles financial crimes against elderly victims. My dad lunged for the phone, actually tried to grab it right out of Robert's hand, yelling that this was a private family matter and we didn't need police involved. Robert held the phone up high over his head like they were kids fighting over a toy, and Dad grabbed his arm trying to pull it down. They were chest to chest, both red-faced and breathing hard, and I thought for sure punches were about to fly. Aunt Linda rushed over and wedged herself between them, pushing them apart with her hands on both their chests, begging them to stop. She was crying harder now, mascara running down her face, saying this wasn't helping anything. Kyle dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the living room, hands over his face, shoulders shaking. He started sobbing these big gulping sobs that sounded fake even though I think they were real, and between the sobs he admitted he had a gambling problem. He said he never meant for it to get this bad, that he thought he could control it, that he was going to pay Grandma back when he finally hit it big. He looked up at everyone with tears and snot running down his face and claimed he'd been so close to a major jackpot that would have fixed everything, that he just needed one more big win. My parents transformed instantly, like someone flipped a switch. Mom dropped to her knees next to Kyle and wrapped her arms around him, rocking him like he was 5 years old. She was saying, "It's okay, baby. You're sick. You need help, not judgment. We're going to get you through this." Dad crouched down too and put his hand on Kyle's back, and then he stood up and addressed the whole room like he was giving a speech. He announced that Kyle had admitted he has a disease, that gambling addiction is a recognized mental illness, and that we all needed to focus on getting him treatment rather than blame and punishment. He said anyone who really loved Kyle would support him through his recovery instead of attacking him when he was at his lowest point. I finally stood up from my chair, the bank statement still clutched in my hand. I looked around at all these relatives, some nodding along with my dad, some looking uncomfortable, some still crying. I asked if anyone remembered that Grandma lived in a cold house eating cheap food while Kyle gambled away her life savings. I said it really slow and clear so everyone could hear. Several relatives nodded, including Uncle Robert and Ella, and one of my cousins said something about how Grandma had complained about being cold last winter. But my parents acted like I'd just said the most cruel and heartless thing imaginable. Mom looked at me with this expression of pure disgust and said I was being unsympathetic to Kyle's mental health struggles. Dad said I was choosing to judge and punish instead of showing compassion for someone suffering from a disease. Uncle Robert made the call anyway, turning away from my dad and walking toward the kitchen with the phone to his ear. I could hear him talking to someone, explaining the situation in his cop voice, all business and facts. He mentioned power of attorney abuse, elder financial exploitation, documented transfers to gambling sites, $200,000 over 6 months. He said he had a family member who worked at the bank with complete documentation of every transaction. My dad followed him to the kitchen doorway, still protesting, saying Robert was making a terrible mistake, and this would destroy the family. Mom stayed on the floor with Kyle, holding him while he cried into her shoulder, and I just stood there with those bank statements in my hand, wondering how we'd gotten to this point where showing evidence of theft was somehow the cruel thing to do. The front door opened and Brittany walked in carrying 2 grocery bags and calling out that she brought the snacks Mom asked for. She stopped in the entryway and her mouth fell open as she took in the scene. Kyle was still on the floor with Mom wrapped around him while he sobbed into her shoulder. Dad stood next to them with his arms crossed, looking ready to fight anyone who came near. Uncle Robert was coming back from the kitchen with his phone still in his hand. Aunt Linda was crying quietly in the corner chair. Ella stood near me holding more bank statements. 3 other relatives were scattered around looking like they wanted to disappear into the furniture. Brittany set the grocery bags down slowly and asked what was going on and why was everyone crying. Kyle lifted his head and tried to say something but just made this choking sound and buried his face back in Mom's shoulder. Dad stepped forward and told Brittany this was a private family matter and maybe she should leave. Ella walked over to Brittany and said she needed to see something important. She held out the bank statements and started explaining in this calm, quiet voice that Kyle had power of attorney for his grandma, and he transferred $200,000 from her accounts to gambling sites over 6 months while Grandma was dying. Brittany took the papers and her hands started shaking as she looked through them. Her face went completely white and she asked if this was real. Ella nodded and showed her the transfer dates and amounts. $50,000 on January 10th to Kyle's account, then to Bet King Casino 3 hours later. $30,000 on January 25th. $40,000 on February 3rd. Every single transfer documented with dates and times. Brittany looked at Kyle and asked if this was true, if he really stole from his dying grandmother to gamble. Kyle finally managed to speak and said it wasn't like that. He has a gambling problem and it's a disease and he couldn't control it. Brittany cut him off and asked how long he'd been lying to her. Her voice got louder and she said she loaned him $5,000 last month that he claimed was for a business investment. Was that gambling money too? Kyle didn't answer and Mom jumped in saying this wasn't the time to attack Kyle when he was clearly suffering and needed support. Dad moved next to Mom and said everyone who really loved Kyle should focus on solutions and getting him help instead of blame and punishment. Mom looked at Brittany and said if she cared about Kyle at all, she would stand by him during his recovery from this terrible disease. Uncle Robert walked back into the living room and announced that Detective Sarah Moore was coming over to take statements and review all the evidence. He said that while the power of attorney made prosecution complicated, the documented pattern of transfers to gambling sites during Grandma's final illness created a strong case for elder financial exploitation. Dad's face turned red and he pointed at the door and told Robert to get out of his house right now. He said Robert had no right to bring police into a private family matter. Robert didn't move and said that Grandma was his sister and he wasn't going to let her death and the theft of her life savings get swept under the rug to protect Kyle. Dad took a step toward Robert with his fists clenched. Aunt Linda stood up and positioned herself between them. The living room split right down the middle like someone drew a line on the floor. Uncle Robert stayed near the kitchen doorway. Aunt Linda moved to stand next to him. Ella walked over to their side, still holding the bank statements. Brittany looked at Kyle one more time, then crossed the room to stand with Ella. I was already on that side of the room. We all stood there facing my parents, who had literally positioned themselves in front of Kyle like bodyguards. A few other relatives looked at each other nervously and stayed in their seats, not sure where to stand or what to do. My cousin from Ohio moved closer to the door like she was planning an escape route. Mom kept her arms around Kyle and glared at all of us like we were attacking her child. Dad stood with his shoulders back and his jaw set in that way that meant he was done listening to anyone. The doorbell rang and everyone froze. Dad said nobody was answering that door. Uncle Robert said that was probably Detective Moore, and refusing to let her in wouldn't help Kyle's situation. Dad walked to the front door and stood in front of it with his arms crossed. The doorbell rang again. A woman's voice called through the door saying she was Detective Moore, and she was here to take statements about a financial exploitation case. Dad yelled through the door that this was a private residence and she needed a warrant. Detective Moore responded calmly that she could take statements at the police station instead if he preferred, and that making this difficult wouldn't help his son. She said she had documentation of suspicious transfers from an elderly woman's accounts, and she was investigating potential exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Dad stood there for another minute, then finally unlocked the door but blocked the entrance with his body. He said he was only letting her in because he insisted on being present for any conversation with Kyle. Detective Moore nodded and said that was fine and stepped inside. She was maybe 40 with short brown hair and wore plain clothes with a badge clipped to her belt. She looked around the room, taking in the crying people and the clear division of the family into 2 groups. She introduced herself and asked where she could set up to review documentation. Dad pointed to the dining room table and said she could use that, but he was staying right there the whole time. Detective Moore agreed and walked to the dining room. She pulled out a notebook and her phone. She asked Ella to start by walking her through the banking documentation. Ella sat down across from her and laid out all the bank statements in order. She explained the timeline of transfers starting in January. $50,000 transferred from Grandma's account to Kyle's personal account on January 10th. The same $50,000 transferred to BetKing Casino 3 hours later. Another $30,000 on January 25th. $40,000 on February 3rd. $25,000 on February 18th. She went through every single transaction with dates and amounts. Detective Moore took notes and photographed each document with her phone. She asked Ella to explain the correlation between transfer dates and Grandma's medical appointments. Ella pulled out a calendar she'd made showing that Kyle transferred money on the same days he was supposedly taking Grandma to doctor visits or picking up her medications. Detective Moore photographed the calendar too. She asked about Grandma's living conditions during this time period. Ella explained that Grandma complained about being cold because Kyle said the heating bill was too expensive. She ate generic food because Kyle said organic was too costly. She wore the same clothes for months because Kyle said new ones weren't in the budget. All while he was transferring thousands of dollars every week to gambling sites. Detective Moore turned to Kyle and asked him to explain the transfers from his grandmother's account to his personal account and then to the gambling sites. Kyle sat up straighter and wiped his eyes, then said Grandma knew exactly what he was doing with the money, and she approved of his investment strategy. He claimed she understood that he was trying to grow her savings, so there would be more for everyone when she passed away. Detective Moore asked if he had any written documentation of his grandmother's approval for these transfers, and Kyle shook his head and said it was all verbal agreements between him and Grandma during their private conversations. He said she trusted him completely, and didn't need everything in writing because they had a special relationship. My dad nodded along like this made perfect sense, and Mom squeezed Kyle's shoulder supportively. I couldn't stay quiet anymore, and interrupted to point out that Grandma had early dementia during the final 6 months, which was documented in all her medical records from the neurologist. Detective Moore looked at me and asked if I had copies of those medical records, and I said I could get them from the doctor's office. Uncle Robert jumped in and added that this was exactly why Kyle pushed so hard for power of attorney, claiming he wanted to protect Grandma from confusion and mistakes with her finances. He said Kyle told the whole family that Grandma was getting forgetful and needed someone responsible to handle her bills and banking. Kyle's face went red and he said that wasn't fair, that he got power of attorney because Grandma asked him to help her because she was stressed about managing everything. Detective Moore made notes and asked Kyle directly if he transferred approximately $200,000 from his grandmother's accounts to online gambling sites between January and June. Kyle looked at my dad, who was already pulling out his phone. Kyle said he wanted to consult an attorney before answering any more questions, and that he didn't feel comfortable continuing this conversation without legal representation. My parents immediately started calling their lawyer friend who handles real estate closings, and Mom was saying they needed him to come over right away because Kyle was interrogated without proper legal counsel. Detective Moore said calmly that Kyle had every right to speak with an attorney, and she respected that decision. She explained that the documented evidence speaks for itself, regardless of whether Kyle provides additional statements, and that the banking records and transaction history create a clear timeline of the financial exploitation. Dad kept trying to reach the lawyer while Mom hovered over Kyle, telling him not to say another word until they had proper representation there. Detective Moore gathered her notes and photographs and said she had enough documentation to move forward with her investigation. She handed me her card and said to contact her if I obtained Grandma's medical records or any other relevant documentation. Uncle Robert walked her to the door and thanked her for coming so quickly. After she left, my parents started yelling at me and Uncle Robert for bringing police into a private family matter and making Kyle look like a criminal. The next week was a mess of phone calls and secret meetings as Uncle Robert coordinated with other relatives who wanted answers about what happened to Grandma's money. He called everyone in the family individually and asked what Kyle had told them about Grandma's expenses and medical care. We discovered that Kyle told different family members completely different stories about where the money was going, and none of the numbers added up at all. He told one aunt that Grandma needed a special medication that cost $3,000 per month. He told another uncle that Grandma's house needed major repairs, including a new roof and foundation work. He told a cousin that Grandma wanted to prepay her funeral expenses and buy a premium burial plot. Every story was different, and when we added up all the amounts Kyle claimed to have spent, it came to way more than the $200,000 that actually disappeared. Aunt Linda took charge of tracking down Grandma's actual medical bills and household expenses from the final 6 months. She called every doctor's office, pharmacy, and service provider that Grandma used. She got copies of bills for medical appointments, prescriptions, home health aides, utilities, and groceries. She made a spreadsheet with every single expense documented and verified. The total came to maybe $30,000 for everything, which meant Kyle gambled away at least $170,000 that had absolutely nothing to do with Grandma's care. When Aunt Linda showed me the spreadsheet, I felt sick looking at how little Kyle actually spent on Grandma compared to what he stole. Ella went to her bank manager and explained the whole situation, asking for permission to provide official statements about the suspicious transaction patterns she'd observed. The bank manager reviewed Ella's documentation and admitted they should have flagged the activity sooner, but the power of attorney documentation appeared legitimate, so the system didn't catch it as potential exploitation. He agreed to let Ella provide official statements and said the bank would cooperate with any investigation. Ella felt relieved that she could speak openly now without worrying about violating privacy rules. I scheduled a meeting with a civil attorney named Mr. Harrison, who specialized in estate litigation and elder abuse cases. His office was in a building downtown and smelled like old books and coffee. Mr. Harrison was maybe 60 with gray hair and reading glasses that he kept pushing up his nose. I brought all the documentation, including bank statements, Ella's timeline, Aunt Linda's expense spreadsheet, and copies of the power of attorney papers. Mr. Harrison spent almost an hour reviewing everything and asking detailed questions about Kyle's relationship with Grandma and the timeline of events. He explained that criminal prosecution was complicated by the power of attorney, because technically Kyle had legal authority to access Grandma's accounts, but civil action for breach of fiduciary duty had much better chances of success. He said that having power of attorney creates a legal responsibility to act in the person's best interest, and using their money for personal benefit like gambling clearly violates that responsibility. Mr. Harrison reviewed all the documentation again, and said we had a strong case that Kyle violated his fiduciary responsibility by using Grandma's money for personal benefit instead of her care. He explained the process for filing a civil lawsuit and what we could potentially recover. Then he gave me the hard news about costs, estimating legal fees around $15,000 with no guarantee of recovering anything if Kyle has no assets. He said even if we won the case and got a judgment, collecting money from someone who's broke and has gambling debts is extremely difficult. I asked if it was worth pursuing, and Mr. Harrison said that depended on whether we wanted justice and accountability or just money back. He said sometimes getting a legal judgment on record matters, even if you never collect a dollar. I told him I needed to talk to Uncle Robert about splitting the costs. When I explained the situation to Uncle Robert, he said he was in for half the attorney fees because this wasn't about the money anymore. It was about making sure Kyle faced real consequences for once in his life. We both knew my parents wouldn't contribute anything toward a lawsuit against their golden child. I called Mr. Harrison back and said we wanted to move forward with the civil case. He said he'd start preparing the paperwork, and we'd need to pay a retainer of $7,500 each to get started. That same afternoon, my mom called crying and begging me not to pursue legal action against Kyle. She said the family was already torn apart, and a lawsuit would destroy any chance of healing and moving forward together. I told her that Kyle destroyed the family when he stole from Grandma and let her live in terrible conditions while he gambled away her life savings. Mom said I was being cruel and vindictive and that I'd regret this decision when it was too late to fix our relationship. Dad sent an email to me and Uncle Robert saying that if we pursued legal action against Kyle, they would consider it harassment and would consult their own attorney about filing a countersuit. He said they had documentation of all the ways they'd supported us over the years, and we were showing incredible ingratitude by attacking their son during his time of need. The email made me realize that the family division wasn't temporary or fixable. It was permanent and getting worse. Uncle Robert forwarded Dad's email to Mr. Harrison and asked if the threat of a countersuit was something to worry about. Mr. Harrison said it was an empty threat meant to intimidate us, and that we had every legal right to pursue civil action for breach of fiduciary duty. He said to document all communication from my parents in case their harassment escalated. I sent Mr. Harrison my half of the retainer fee, and Uncle Robert sent his portion the same day. Within 3 days of us filing the retainer, Kyle hired his own attorney named Richard Crane, who specialized in criminal defense. Uncle Robert heard about it through his police contacts before my parents even told anyone. Mr. Crane immediately started making statements to Detective Moore about how Kyle's gambling addiction was a recognized mental illness that impaired his judgment and decision-making abilities. He was building a defense around diminished capacity, claiming Kyle couldn't form criminal intent because his addiction was controlling his actions. Detective Moore called to warn me that this was a common strategy in financial exploitation cases, and that it sometimes worked to reduce charges or avoid prosecution entirely. She said the key would be proving that Kyle knew what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway, which the pattern of lies and cover-ups would help establish. My parents jumped on this narrative like it was a life raft. Within a week, they were telling everyone who would listen that Kyle was a victim of disease who needed treatment and compassion, not punishment. Mom actually posted on Facebook about the importance of supporting family members struggling with addiction and how society needs to view addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. She didn't mention Kyle by name, but everyone knew what she was talking about. Several relatives who didn't know the full story about Grandma's money commented with supportive messages about how brave she was to speak out and how proud they were of her for standing by her son. I wanted to scream every time I saw another comment praising my parents for their compassion and understanding. Meanwhile, I spent an entire weekend creating a detailed timeline document that showed Kyle's pattern of manipulation and lies going back years. I started with the cheating incidents in high school where Dad called the principal to make excuses. Then the drunk driving accident they covered up and bought him a new truck afterward. The failed business that lost $20,000 of their retirement money. Every time he stole from Mom's purse or when Dad's tools went missing. The recording studio they built that he never used. I documented every double standard, every excuse they made, every consequence I faced for minor mistakes while Kyle got away with major ones. The document ended up being 12 pages long with dates and specific incidents. I sent copies to Uncle Robert, Ella, and Mr. Harrison. Ella added her own observations about Kyle's behavior at family gatherings over the past 5 years. She remembered him borrowing $200 from Aunt Linda for car repairs that never happened. She'd seen him ask Uncle Robert's son for $500 for a business opportunity that never materialized. She recalled a Christmas 3 years ago when Kyle borrowed $300 from our cousin Michelle to help with rent and never paid it back. We started comparing notes and realized Kyle had been running small-scale scams on the family for years, always with different stories, always promising to pay people back, never following through. Uncle Robert took it upon himself to interview other relatives privately about their interactions with Kyle. He approached it like a detective investigation, asking specific questions about money Kyle had borrowed or business deals he'd proposed. What he discovered was shocking even to me. Kyle had borrowed money from at least 8 different family members over the past 3 years, with amounts ranging from $200 to $5,000. The total came to about $30,000 that nobody had been repaid. Each person had a different story from Kyle about why he needed the money. Temporary cash flow problems, an investment opportunity that required quick action, medical bills for a health scare he never told our parents about, car repairs after an accident. Every story was designed to create urgency and sympathy while avoiding any verification or follow-up. Uncle Robert documented everything in a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and the stories Kyle had told each person. We brought all this information to Detective Moore at her office downtown. She spread the documents across her desk and studied them for a long time without saying anything. Finally, she looked up and said this established a clear pattern of financial manipulation that strengthened the case against Kyle significantly. She explained that one of the challenges with the grandma situation was that Kyle's attorney could argue it was an isolated incident caused by gambling addiction spiraling out of control. But this pattern going back years showed deliberate, repeated deceptive behavior for personal gain. It demonstrated that Kyle knew how to manipulate people, knew how to create convincing stories, and knew how to avoid getting caught. The addiction defense became much weaker when you could show the person was running calculated scams while supposedly impaired by their disease. Detective Moore said she was building a file that would make it very difficult for Kyle to claim he didn't understand what he was doing or couldn't control his actions. My parents somehow found out about Uncle Robert's interviews with relatives. I'm still not sure who told them, but suddenly we got an email sent to the entire extended family from Dad's account. The subject line was, "Family Unity and False Accusations." The email accused me, Ella, and Uncle Robert of conducting a witch hunt against Kyle and trying to destroy the family. It said we were harassing vulnerable family members and manipulating them into making statements against Kyle during his time of greatest need. It claimed we refused to acknowledge that addiction is a disease requiring treatment, not punishment, and that our actions were driven by jealousy and vindictiveness, rather than genuine concern. The email ended with a plea for everyone to remember the importance of family loyalty, and to resist efforts to tear the family apart over money and misunderstandings. I read it 3 times in complete disbelief. They were actually positioning themselves as the victims and Kyle as the one being persecuted. Several relatives replied all with messages supporting my parents and saying they'd pray for family healing. A few others replied privately to me saying they stood with us and knew the truth about what Kyle had done. The family was splitting into clear sides, and the division was getting worse every day. 3 weeks after the initial confrontation at the family meeting, my mom sent out another group email announcing that Kyle had checked himself into a 30-day gambling addiction treatment program at a facility 2 hours away. She framed it as proof that Kyle was taking responsibility and getting the help he needed. The email strongly suggested that now that Kyle was in treatment, legal action should be dropped, so he could focus on recovery without the stress of lawsuits hanging over his head. She included a link to an article about how family support is crucial for addiction recovery, and how punitive approaches often lead to relapse. I forwarded the email to Mr. Harrison and asked if Kyle entering treatment changed anything about our civil case. He called me back within an hour and explained that entering treatment doesn't erase civil liability for breach of fiduciary duty. He said it might be something Kyle's attorney would bring up to gain sympathy, but it had no legal bearing on whether Kyle owed restitution for the money he stole. Mr. Harrison said he was ready to file the lawsuit and that we shouldn't wait any longer. We'd given Kyle and my parents plenty of time to make this right voluntarily, and they'd chosen to attack us instead. He filed the lawsuit that same week seeking recovery of the stolen funds, plus interest and legal fees, which totaled about $230,000. The lawsuit named Kyle as the defendant and detailed the breach of fiduciary duty, the transfers to gambling sites, and the financial harm to Grandma's estate, and the intended beneficiaries. Kyle's attorney, Richard Crane, responded with a motion 2 weeks later claiming that Kyle had no assets to recover and that pursuing the lawsuit would only prevent him from focusing on his addiction recovery. The motion included financial statements showing Kyle was completely broke with significant debts of his own. It argued that the lawsuit was punitive rather than restorative and would cause psychological harm that could trigger relapse. The motion requested that the case be dismissed, or at minimum stayed until Kyle completed treatment and had time to establish stable recovery. What happened next made my blood boil. My parents announced they would pay Kyle's legal fees to fight the lawsuit. These were the same parents who said they couldn't help with my student loans because they needed to be smart with money. The same parents who said maybe next year when I asked for $1,000 for a professional certification. Suddenly they had money available to pay a criminal defense attorney to help Kyle avoid consequences for stealing $200,000 from Grandma. The hypocrisy was so extreme I couldn't even process it at first. Mr. Harrison said this was actually helpful information because it showed my parents had resources they'd been claiming they didn't have. It also demonstrated their continued pattern of enabling Kyle's behavior by protecting him from consequences. He said we'd respond to the motion and push forward with the case regardless of their financial support for Kyle's defense. The discovery process started 2 weeks after that with Mr. Harrison sending formal requests for Kyle's financial records, employment history, bank statements from the past 3 years, and documentation of any assets he owned. Kyle's attorney, Richard Crane, responded with boxes of disorganized papers that we had to sort through page by page. I spent 3 evenings at Mr. Harrison's office going through Kyle's bank statements and credit card bills, highlighting every transfer and cash withdrawal. We found receipts for restaurants I knew Kyle couldn't afford on his call center salary, payments to online gambling sites under different names, and cash advances from multiple credit cards that were never paid back. Mr. Harrison scheduled Kyle's deposition for 6 weeks out and requested that he bring documentation of his current employment, living situation, and any money he'd received from family members in the past year. That's when we found the transfer to Brittany's account. It showed up on a bank statement from 3 months before Grandma died. $40,000 moved from one of Kyle's accounts to an account in Brittany's name with a memo line that said payment for business consulting services. I called Brittany immediately and asked if she knew anything about $40,000 Kyle gave her last year. She went quiet for a long moment before asking what I was talking about, and I explained what we'd found in the discovery documents. Brittany said Kyle told her it was from his business profits, and he needed to park the money in her account temporarily for tax reasons. She thought it was legitimate business income and had already spent about $15,000 of it on a car repair and helping her mom with medical bills. I told her the money came from Grandma's accounts, and she started crying on the phone saying she had no idea, and she'd return every penny she had left. Mr. Harrison said Brittany wasn't legally responsible since she received the money in good faith without knowledge of its source, but her willingness to return it showed Kyle had been lying to everyone about where Grandma's money went. Brittany transferred the remaining $25,000 back within 2 days, and provided a written statement explaining how Kyle had deceived her about the source of the funds. 3 days after that conversation, my phone started blowing up with text messages from Kyle. The first one said he was sorry for everything, and he knew he'd messed up badly, and he just wanted a chance to make things right. The second message 20 minutes later said I was destroying his life and making it impossible for him to focus on recovery. The third message said if I really cared about family, I'd drop the lawsuit and give him space to heal. Over the next week, I got maybe 30 messages that alternated between apologizing and blaming me for tearing the family apart. Kyle said I was being vindictive and cruel, that I was choosing money over my own brother, that Mom was crying every day because of what I was doing to him. He said the lawsuit was preventing him from moving forward with his life, and that I'd regret this when he relapsed and it was my fault. I didn't respond to any of the messages, but I took screenshots of every single one and backed them up in 3 different places. Mr. Harrison said they were perfect evidence of Kyle's continued manipulation tactics and his lack of genuine remorse for stealing from Grandma. He said the pattern of alternating between apology and blame was textbook manipulator behavior and would be useful if we ended up in front of a judge. The messages kept coming for another week before finally stopping. Then Mom called me on a Tuesday night and I could hear her crying before she even said hello. She begged me to drop the lawsuit because it was killing her to watch the family fall apart like this. She said Kyle had learned his lesson and was getting help, and that continuing with legal action was just about revenge, not justice. I let her talk for maybe 5 minutes before I interrupted and asked her a direct question. I said Kyle stole $200,000 from her dying mother-in-law and let Grandma live in terrible conditions while he gambled the money away. So did she think that deserved consequences, or should Kyle just get therapy and move on with his life? Mom got quiet for a moment before admitting that what Kyle did was wrong, but then she said he was sick, and punishing him wouldn't bring Grandma back or recover the money. She said I was choosing money over family, and that I'd regret destroying these relationships when it was too late to fix them. I realized right then during that conversation that my mom was never going to hold Kyle truly accountable for what he did. Maintaining a relationship with my parents meant accepting their version of reality where Kyle was a victim of disease, rather than someone who made deliberate choices to steal from a dying woman. I told Mom I needed space to think about what kind of relationship we could have going forward, and she started crying harder, saying I was abandoning the family just like I'd abandoned Kyle. I ended the call and sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to process what had just happened. 2 days later, I got a formal email from Dad with the subject line Family Decisions and Consequences. He wrote that if I continued with the lawsuit against Kyle, they would consider me to have chosen to remove myself from the family. The email listed all the ways they'd supported me over the years: the tuition help for my first year of college before I got scholarships, the car they'd co-signed for when I was 22, the times they'd let me stay with them between apartments. Dad said this was how I repaid their love and sacrifice, by attacking my brother when he was at his lowest point and needed family support the most. He said I had 1 week to decide whether I wanted to be part of this family or continue down a path of bitterness and revenge. I forwarded the email to Mr. Harrison without comment, and he called me within an hour saying this was more evidence of the family pattern that enabled Kyle's behavior for years. That weekend, Uncle Robert called and said he'd been talking with Aunt Linda and Ella about everything that had happened. He said they wanted to form a support group for those of us dealing with the aftermath of Kyle's theft and our parents' enabling behavior. We started meeting every Thursday night at Uncle Robert's house, just the 4 of us at first, talking about the crazy things our parents said to defend Kyle, and reminding each other that we weren't wrong for expecting consequences. Ella brought her notes from years of watching Kyle manipulate different family members, and we started documenting patterns we'd all observed but never connected before. Aunt Linda made coffee and listened while we vented about the latest guilt trip attempts from my parents. Uncle Robert shared stories about cases he'd worked where family members enabled destructive behavior until it was too late, and how important it was to maintain boundaries even when it felt cruel. Those Thursday meetings became the only place I felt sane during those weeks of legal proceedings and family pressure. 5 weeks after filing the lawsuit, Kyle's financial disclosure documents arrived in a thick manila envelope that Mr. Harrison walked me through page by page in his office. Kyle had no assets at all, no savings account, no retirement fund, no property, nothing of value except a 7-year-old car with a broken transmission sitting in my parents' driveway. He owed about $70,000 to various online gambling sites and personal loan companies, plus another $8,000 on credit cards he'd maxed out. His employment history showed he'd been working part-time at a call center for the past 4 months making minimum wage, averaging maybe 20 hours a week. Before that, he'd been unemployed for 6 months, living with our parents and supposedly looking for work. The disclosure listed every debt, every failed payment plan, every account sent to collections. Mr. Harrison spread the papers across his desk and explained that even winning the lawsuit wouldn't mean we'd actually recover any money. We could get a judgment against Kyle that would follow him for years, maybe decades depending on the state laws. And we could garnish his wages if he ever got a real job, but the reality was that collecting from someone with negative net worth was basically impossible. He showed me the math, how wage garnishment typically takes maybe 10 or 15% of someone's paycheck after taxes and other mandatory deductions, and how Kyle's part-time minimum wage job would yield maybe $30 or $40 per month at most. At that rate, it would take over 400 years to recover the $200,000. Mr. Harrison said we could pursue the judgment anyway, because it would legally establish what Kyle did and create consequences that would affect his credit and financial future. But I needed to understand that actual money recovery was not going to happen anytime soon. I sat in that office staring at Kyle's financial disclosure and had to decide whether continuing the lawsuit made any sense at all. The whole point had been to hold Kyle accountable and recover at least some of Grandma's money for the family. But if there was nothing to recover, then what was the point of spending more money on legal fees? I called Uncle Robert from my car in the parking lot and explained the situation, reading him some of the numbers from the disclosure. He was quiet for a minute, then said it wasn't really about the money anymore. It was about making sure Kyle faced legal consequences for what he did, instead of just skating by with therapy and sympathy like always. Ella said the same thing when I talked to her that evening, that if we dropped the lawsuit now, then Kyle would learn once again that he could do terrible things and face no real consequences. We met at Uncle Robert's house the next Thursday and talked through all the options, the 3 of us sitting around his kitchen table with coffee, and the financial disclosure papers spread out between us. Uncle Robert said that in his years as a cop, he'd seen too many cases where family members let things slide, because pursuing justice seemed too hard or too expensive, and then the person just kept doing worse things because they knew they'd get away with it. Ella pointed out that we'd already spent the money on the retainer and filed the lawsuit, so stopping now would mean Kyle won by simply being broke and pathetic. I realized they were both right, that this had stopped being about money recovery somewhere along the way, and had become about establishing that actions have consequences even within families. Mom called me 2 days later and said she had something important to tell me, that she'd been working with her therapist, and had what she described as a breakthrough. Her voice sounded different, less defensive and more tired, like she'd been crying recently. She said she was starting to recognize how her favoritism toward Kyle had damaged both of her sons over the years, how she'd held me to impossible standards while letting Kyle get away with everything, because she was afraid of losing his love. She apologized for all the double standards, for the way she'd dismissed my accomplishments while celebrating Kyle's failures as learning experiences, for making me pay for the scraped garage door while buying Kyle a new truck after drunk driving. She went through specific examples from our childhood and teenage years, acknowledging things I'd pointed out dozens of times but that she'd always denied or minimized. The apology felt genuine in a way I'd never heard from her before, like she was actually seeing the pattern instead of just defending herself. She cried while talking about how she'd enabled Kyle's behavior for so long, that she'd helped create the person who could steal from his dying grandmother, and how she needed to take responsibility for her part in that. But then she said she hoped that now that she was acknowledging all of this, I would consider dropping the lawsuit and letting the family move forward together. She said she understood why I was angry and hurt, and she accepted that she'd caused a lot of that pain, but continuing to pursue legal action against Kyle would just create more damage and prevent any healing from happening. She wanted us to focus on being a family again, on supporting Kyle's recovery while also building a healthier dynamic where both her sons felt valued and loved. The apology that had felt so genuine suddenly felt incomplete, like she was acknowledging past mistakes, but not accepting that current consequences were appropriate. She was admitting she'd been wrong for years, but still wanted me to protect Kyle from the results of his choices, which was exactly the same pattern that created this whole situation. I told Mom that I appreciated her recognizing the favoritism and the double standards, that it meant something to hear her actually admit those things out loud instead of denying them. But I explained that I needed to see sustained change behavior over time, not just words and promises during one phone call. I said that dropping the lawsuit now would be repeating the exact pattern of protecting Kyle from consequences that had enabled his behavior for his entire life. She started crying harder and said I was being cruel and unforgiving, that she was trying to make things right and I was throwing it back in her face. I stayed calm and repeated that changed behavior over time was what mattered, not apologies that came with conditions attached. She said she didn't know how to fix this if I wouldn't even give her a chance, and I told her that letting the lawsuit proceed was part of giving everyone a chance to build something healthier. We ended the call without resolving anything, and I felt exhausted and sad, but also clear that I'd made the right choice. 6 weeks after the initial confrontation, Kyle completed his 30-day gambling treatment program at some facility my parents had found and paid for. They threw him a celebration dinner for taking control of his recovery, inviting the whole extended family to recognize his achievement and support his journey. The invitation came through a group text from Mom with details about the restaurant and time, saying how proud they were of Kyle for doing the hard work of facing his addiction. I didn't respond to the group text, but Mom called me directly 2 days before the dinner asking if I was coming, saying it would mean so much to Kyle to have his brother there supporting him. I told her I wasn't going to celebrate Kyle completing basic treatment that he should have done years ago, especially when he was only in treatment because he got caught stealing $200,000. She said I was being petty and holding grudges instead of supporting family, that Kyle was making real changes and deserved recognition for his effort. I said no thanks and ended the call, then immediately got texts from Dad saying I was disappointing them again and choosing bitterness over family unity. The civil lawsuit moved forward to mediation about a week after Kyle's celebration dinner that I didn't attend. Mr. Harrison called me the morning of the mediation to go over what to expect, explaining that Kyle's attorney had indicated they wanted to propose a settlement rather than go to trial. The mediation happened in a conference room at a legal office downtown, with Mr. Harrison and me on one side of a long table, and Kyle's attorney on the other side. Kyle wasn't even there, which his attorney explained was standard for mediation sessions, because having the parties in the same room often made negotiations harder. The settlement proposal was straightforward. Kyle would sign documents admitting that he breached his fiduciary duty to Grandma and misappropriated her funds for personal use. He would agree to a payment plan of $200 per month for 10 years, with the payments going into an account that would be distributed to Grandma's intended heirs. He would also commit to continued gambling addiction treatment with proof provided every 3 months, and if he missed payments or stopped treatment, the entire remaining balance would become immediately due. Kyle's attorney presented this as a reasonable resolution that acknowledged wrongdoing while being realistic about Kyle's ability to pay, and he emphasized that going to trial would cost everyone more money with probably worse outcomes. Mr. Harrison asked for a break to discuss the offer privately, and we moved to a smaller conference room down the hall. He pulled out his calculator and showed me the math. $200 per month for 10 years equals $24,000 total, which is roughly 12% of what Kyle actually stole from Grandma. He said that from a pure financial recovery standpoint, this was probably more than we'd get through wage garnishment over the same time period given Kyle's employment situation. The real value of the settlement was getting Kyle's admission of wrongdoing on legal record, which could never be erased and would follow him permanently. Mr. Harrison recommended accepting the settlement because it achieved the main goal of establishing consequences and legal accountability, even though the financial recovery was minimal. He also pointed out that going to trial would cost another $10,000 in legal fees with no guarantee of a better outcome, and that judges often looked favorably on defendants who admitted wrongdoing and proposed reasonable payment plans. I called Uncle Robert from the conference room and explained the settlement terms, reading him the exact language about admitting wrongdoing and the payment structure. He put me on speaker so Ella could hear too, and we talked through whether accepting such a small amount was basically letting Kyle off easy. Ella said $24,000 was insulting compared to $200,000, but Uncle Robert pointed out that we'd already established that Kyle had nothing to take, so this was about getting the admission on record more than the money. I asked what they honestly thought we should do, and after a long pause, Uncle Robert said we should accept it. He explained that the legal admission of breaching fiduciary duty would be part of Kyle's permanent record, that it would affect his ability to ever have power of attorney or manage anyone else's finances, and that it established in official legal documents that he stole from his dying grandmother. Ella agreed that having that on record was worth more than fighting for years over money we'd probably never collect anyway. We recognized together that this was about establishing consequences and getting Kyle's admission documented in a way that couldn't be denied or minimized, rather than full financial recovery that was never realistic given his situation. We went back to Mr. Ed Harrison's office the next week for the actual signing. Kyle showed up with his attorney and my parents, who looked like they were attending a funeral, instead of their son admitting to stealing from his dying grandmother. The conference room felt smaller this time with just the 6 of us around the table. Mr. Ed Harrison laid out the settlement documents in front of Kyle and walked through each section out loud. This paragraph states that you, Kyle Young, acknowledge and admit that you breached your fiduciary duty as power of attorney to Dorothy Young. This section states that you misappropriated approximately $200,000 from her accounts for personal use, specifically online gambling, between January and June of this year. Kyle's hand shook when he picked up the pen. My mom reached over and squeezed his shoulder, but he pulled away and signed each page where his attorney pointed. The admission was now part of his permanent legal record and could never be erased or explained away. Mr. Harrison collected the signed documents and made copies for everyone, while Kyle stared at the table and my parents glared at me like I'd personally destroyed their son's life, instead of just holding him accountable for destroying Grandma's. My parents called me 3 days after the signing. Dad did most of the talking while Mom cried in the background. They wanted to discuss the payment terms because $200 per month was going to prevent Kyle from getting back on his feet financially, and maybe we could reduce it to $100, or let them make the payments for him. I reminded Dad that the settlement specifically stated Kyle had to make the payments himself, and that any third-party payments would void the agreement. He got quiet for a minute and then said I was being unnecessarily rigid and punitive when Kyle was already struggling with his gambling addiction and trying to rebuild his life. I told him that Kyle gambled away $200,000 while Grandma froze in her house and ate generic bread, and that $24,000 over 10 years was getting off incredibly easy. Mom grabbed the phone and said through tears that I was choosing money over family and that she didn't raise me to be so cold and unforgiving. I hung up when she started asking why I couldn't just let it go and move forward. 2 months after everything exploded, I sat down and wrote out clear boundaries for my relationship with my parents. I'd attend Thanksgiving and Christmas because those were major holidays that involved the whole extended family. I wouldn't come to smaller gatherings where Kyle was the center of attention or being celebrated for basic adult responsibilities like keeping a job or staying away from gambling. I wouldn't discuss Kyle or the lawsuit or the settlement with them at all because every conversation turned into them defending him and attacking me. I sent the boundaries in an email so there was written documentation, and so they couldn't interrupt or argue while I was explaining. Mom called within an hour and spent 20 minutes trying to convince me to be more flexible. She said families are supposed to forgive and move past difficulties together, and that my rigid boundaries were just another way of punishing Kyle and them. I repeated that these were my terms for maintaining any relationship at all, and that I wasn't negotiating. She said I'd regret this someday when it was too late to fix things, and hung up crying. The boundaries held, but Mom tested them constantly. She'd call every few days with some new angle about why I should be more forgiving or flexible. Kyle was doing so well in his recovery, and it would mean so much to him if I came to his birthday dinner. Kyle got a promotion at work, and they were having a small celebration, and couldn't I just stop by for an hour? She'd send text messages with photos of family gatherings I'd declined to attend with captions about how sad it was that I was missing these precious moments. Dad mostly respected the boundaries in practice, but made passive-aggressive comments whenever we did see each other. At Thanksgiving, he mentioned 3 times how nice it was when the whole family could be together without drama and division. When I helped clear dishes after Christmas dinner, he said something about how family loyalty and forgiveness used to mean something in this family. I didn't take the bait either time and just changed the subject or walked away. Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda became my primary family connection almost immediately. We started having dinner together every Tuesday night at their house, and they'd call to check in on weekends. Linda would text me funny memes or articles she thought I'd like during the week. Robert made a point of inviting me to things he knew my parents wouldn't attend, like baseball games or hiking trips. They'd also set boundaries with my parents around Kyle topics, and refused to engage when mom or dad tried to complain about my rigidity or convince them to talk sense into me. Linda told me that mom called her crying one night and asked her to explain that families are supposed to stick together no matter what. Linda said she told mom that sticking together doesn't mean protecting people from consequences, and that maybe if they'd held Kyle accountable years ago, Grandma would still have her savings. Mom apparently hung up on her too. The other relatives who'd supported accountability at the family meeting also stayed in closer contact with me, and we formed this unofficial coalition of people who refused to pretend everything was fine. Ella and I got much closer through everything that happened. We started meeting for dinner once a month at this Thai place halfway between our apartments, and we'd spend hours talking about family patterns and supporting each other in maintaining boundaries. She told me about growing up watching Kyle get away with everything and feeling crazy, because nobody else seemed to notice or care. I told her about the years of double standards and feeling like nothing I did was ever good enough. We realized we'd both been gaslit by my parents for decades into thinking we were the problems. Ella started dating this guy named Daniel who worked in her building, and she actually introduced him to me before telling my parents, which felt really significant. She said she wanted people she trusted to meet him first, instead of letting my parents form opinions and create drama. We took Daniel to the Thai place, and he was genuinely nice and seemed good for her. When Ella finally told my parents about Daniel a month later, Mom immediately asked when they were getting engaged, and whether Ella had thought about what kind of wedding she wanted. Ella shut it down fast and said they'd been dating 8 weeks, and Mom needed to calm down. 3 months after the initial confrontation, I started seeing a therapist to work through the complicated feelings about my family. I'd been carrying around so much anger and hurt and confusion about why my parents chose Kyle over truth and accountability. My therapist helped me understand that I'd been grieving not just the grandma situation, but the fantasy of having parents who would choose what's right over what's comfortable. She pointed out that I kept hoping they'd suddenly wake up and recognize how badly they'd failed both their sons by enabling Kyle and holding me to impossible standards. We worked on accepting my parents as they actually are instead of who I wished they'd be. She said I could love them while also accepting that our relationship would never be what I'd hoped for, and that both things could be true at the same time. It helped to have someone validate that my feelings were reasonable, and that setting boundaries wasn't cruel or punitive, but actually healthy and necessary. Mr. Harrison sent me confirmation that Kyle made his first payment on time. $200 deposited to the account we'd set up for tracking the settlement. The second payment came through on time too, exactly 30 days later. I had no idea if Kyle was actually working on his gambling addiction or just going through the motions to satisfy the settlement terms. Mr. Harrison said the treatment program verification forms came through quarterly, and the first one showed Kyle attending group meetings twice a week. But I'd accepted that it wasn't my responsibility to monitor his recovery or care whether he was genuinely changing. My responsibility was to myself and to honoring Grandma's memory by making sure Kyle faced some kind of consequences, even if they were minimal compared to what he'd actually done. The hardest part of everything wasn't actually the money Grandma lost, or even Kyle's theft. It was grieving the fantasy of having parents who would choose what's right over what's comfortable. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn their approval and recognition by being responsible and successful and doing everything right. And Kyle spent his whole life getting their unconditional support and protection, no matter what he did wrong. When the moment came that should have finally made them see the pattern, they doubled down on protecting him instead. That realization hurt worse than any amount of stolen money, because it meant accepting that nothing I could ever do would change how they saw us. I was learning to accept them as they are instead of hoping they'd suddenly transform into the parents I needed them to be. Uncle Robert invited me over for coffee one Saturday morning about a week after Kyle's second payment came through. We sat on his back porch and he told me that Grandma would be proud of how I stood up for what was right, even when it was hard and lonely. He said Grandma had her own struggles with family members who took advantage of her kindness over the years. Her sister borrowed money constantly and never paid it back. Her brother got her to co-sign a loan he defaulted on. She spent decades being the family doormat because she thought being nice and forgiving was the same as being good. Robert said that toward the end of her life, Grandma told him she wished she'd had more backbone earlier and stood up to people who used her. She said the people she respected most were the ones who did the right thing even when it cost them something. Robert squeezed my shoulder and said, I had the backbone Grandma wished she'd developed sooner, and that she'd be grateful someone finally held Kyle accountable, even though it fractured the family. 4 months after the confrontation, I started hosting Thanksgiving at my apartment with Uncle Robert, Aunt Linda, Ella, and a few other relatives who stood up for what was right. We ordered pizza instead of cooking turkey because nobody wanted to spend hours in the kitchen pretending everything was normal. Ella brought her new boyfriend and actually seemed relaxed for the first time in months. Uncle Robert told stories about Grandma that made us laugh instead of cry. We played board games and nobody mentioned Kyle or my parents or the settlement. It felt weird at first to celebrate a holiday without the whole family, but also kind of freeing because we didn't have to walk on eggshells or ignore obvious problems. We decided to make it a regular thing, getting together once a month for dinner or coffee, building something new instead of trying to fix something broken. My parents sent a group text on Christmas asking if I'd reconsider spending the holidays with them, and I replied that I'd stop by for an hour on Christmas afternoon but wouldn't stay for dinner. They actually respected that boundary, which surprised me. Mom texted separately saying she understood I needed space and that she was working on herself in therapy. Dad didn't say much, but he stopped sending passive-aggressive messages about family loyalty. Kyle made his fourth payment on time according to the notifications from the settlement account. I had no idea if he was actually staying away from gambling or just learned to hide it better. Mr. Harrison sent confirmation emails each month showing the deposits, and I filed them away without much emotion. The whole situation taught me that justice in families doesn't look like justice in movies. Nobody went to jail. Kyle didn't have some big moment of genuine remorse. My parents didn't suddenly realize they'd been wrong for decades. What I got instead was $200 a month, some relatives who actually cared about doing the right thing, and the knowledge that I stood up for Grandma even when it cost me the fantasy of having normal parents. That had to be enough because it was all I was going to get.